There are traces of bilirubin in it, which is what keeps the blood ruddy, reddish color instead of turning a very dark brown, almost black.
A lab test was conducted in the Vatican. It was supposed to be a simple routine test, just a tiny piece of Jesus's burial cloth under UV light. But when the light hit the fabric, something unexpected appeared. Sharp shapes, strange marks, and a bright outline no one could explain. What did the ultraviolet light reveal? This changes a lot about what we know of the death of Christ. The shocking experiment. In October 2024, a Vatican research facility conducted an examination that had been postponed for over 3 decades. The subject was a 12 centimeter by 8 centimeter fragment of the Shroud of Turin. The method was ultraviolet spectroscopy. The results would challenge everything scientists thought they understood about this ancient artifact. The Vatican had commissioned a specialized laboratory specifically for this analysis. The facility, located beneath the Vatican Library, required nearly €2 million in equipment and modifications. Lead-lined walls prevented external radiation interference. Custom ultraviolet imaging systems examined wavelengths invisible to the human eye. Security protocols matched those of the Vatican's secret archives. No photographs were permitted. No outside observers were allowed. 3 scientists received clearance to conduct the examination. Dr. Elena Marchetti, a forensic imaging specialist from the University of Padua, had spent 17 years requesting access to shroud samples. Professor Klaus Hoffmann brought expertise in textile analysis from the Max Planck Institute in Germany. Father Thomas Brennan, a molecular biologist from Boston College and ordained Catholic priest, served as the Vatican's official observer. Each scientist had signed confidentiality agreements before entering the laboratory. The fragment carried significant history. During a conservation effort in 1973, researchers removed several small samples from the main shroud for future testing. Most were used for the controversial carbon dating experiments of 1988. One fragment remained untested. This piece showed part of what appeared to be a human face, specifically the region around the left eye and cheekbone. For 51 years, it had been stored in a climate-controlled vault. The fragment arrived in a sealed titanium container transported under armed guard. The seal bore the official mark of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Breaking this seal required authorization from the Pope himself. That authorization had taken 8 years to obtain. Ultraviolet light occupies a portion of the electromagnetic spectrum beyond human vision. Different materials react differently when exposed to UV radiation. Modern paints and dyes emit characteristic signatures. Medieval pigments show specific absorption rates. By analyzing how the shroud fragment responded to various UV wavelengths, scientists hope to determine the age and composition of the image. Previous examinations of the full shroud had produced contradictory results. Carbon dating in 1988 suggested the cloth originated between 1260 and 1390, placing it firmly in the medieval period. However, other analyses identified characteristics inconsistent with medieval manufacture. The weaving pattern matched first-century Middle Eastern textile production. Pollen samples came from plants native to ancient Palestine. Blood residue contained human hemoglobin, but showed unusual chemical properties. The Vatican had never officially declared the shroud authentic. Church policy maintained careful distance from relics requiring scientific validation. Yet the institution had spent enormous resources preserving and studying this artifact. The decision to conduct UV spectroscopy analysis suggested Vatican officials believed something significant might be discovered. The examination began at 9:30 in the morning. Dr. Marchetti positioned the fragment under the primary UV imaging array. Professor Hoffmann calibrated the spectroscopy equipment to scan wavelengths from 200 to 400 nanometers. Father Brennan monitored the data recording systems. The laboratory lights were extinguished. When the ultraviolet lamps activated, the fragment revealed details hidden for centuries. Under normal light, the image appeared as barely visible discoloration. Under UV illumination, the cloth transformed. Patterns emerged. The facial features acquired depth and definition that seemed impossible for a flat image on ancient linen. The scientists expected to find evidence of artistic technique. Medieval forgers typically used tempera paint, iron oxide pigments, or blood mixed with binding agents. All leave traces detectable under UV light. But the spectrum analysis showed none of these signatures. The image was not painted, drawn, or stained using any known medieval method. The discoloration affected only the outermost fibers of the linen threads. The depth of penetration measured less than 0.2 microns, thinner than a single-cell wall. No known painting or staining technique could achieve such superficial marking. The coloration showed no directionality, no brush strokes, no evidence of applied substances. It appeared as if the image had been scorched onto the cloth surface by an instantaneous burst of energy. Further analysis revealed three-dimensional information encoded in the image intensity. Areas showing darker discoloration corresponded to surfaces closer to a body. Lighter areas represented greater distances. This relationship produced a topographical map when processed through computer analysis. Medieval artists did not understand three-dimensional encoding. They had no technology to create it, yet this property existed throughout the shroud fragment. By noon, the scientific team had documented anomalies that could not be reconciled with conventional explanations. The Vatican observers requested multiple verification runs. The same tests were repeated using different equipment. The results remained consistent. Whatever created the image operated through a mechanism unknown to modern science or medieval art. The examination that was supposed to provide answers had generated profound new questions, and the most disturbing discoveries were yet to come. The cloth that haunts Christianity. The Shroud of Turin first appeared in documented history during the year 1353. A French knight named Geoffroy de Charny displayed the cloth in a small wooden church in Lirey, France. He claimed it was the authentic burial shroud of Jesus Christ. The announcement attracted thousands of pilgrims. It also attracted immediate controversy. Local church officials questioned the shroud's authenticity. The Bishop of Troyes, Henri de Poitiers, launched an investigation. He could find no evidence of where de Charny had obtained the cloth. No records existed of its presence before 1353. No documentation traced its journey from 1st century Jerusalem to 14th century France. The bishop declared the shroud a painted forgery designed to deceive pilgrims and extract money from believers. Despite this condemnation, the shroud survived. The de Charny family kept possession of the relic. Pilgrims continued visiting. The controversy continued growing. In 1390, Bishop Pierre d'Arcis wrote to Pope Clement VII, demanding the shroud be seized and destroyed. The letter described how an artist had confessed to painting the image. The Pope responded with a compromise. The shroud could be displayed, but only as a representation of the burial cloth, not as the authentic article itself. This careful distinction between veneration and authentication would define the Vatican's relationship with the shroud for the next 6 centuries. The Catholic Church never officially confirmed the shroud's authenticity, yet the institution never condemned it as fraudulent either. This calculated ambiguity allowed believers to maintain faith while protecting the Church from embarrassment if the relic proved false. The shroud changed hands multiple times over the following centuries. In 1453, the de Charny family sold it to the House of Savoy, Italian nobility with connections to the papacy. The Savoy moved the cloth to their capital in Chambéry. In 1532, a fire damaged the chapel where the shroud was stored. Molten silver from the reliquary dripped onto the folded cloth, burning holes through multiple layers. Nuns repaired the damage by sewing patches over the burned areas. These repair patches would later complicate scientific analysis. The House of Savoy relocated their capital to Turin in 1578. The shroud moved with them. It has remained in Turin ever since, housed in the royal chapel of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. The Italian royal family maintained custody until 1983, when the last king of Italy died and bequeathed the shroud to the Vatican. For centuries, the shroud remained an object of faith rather than scientific inquiry. Believers accepted it as genuine. Skeptics dismissed it as medieval forgery. No one possessed the tools or methods to test either claim objectively. That changed in 1898 when an Italian photographer named Secondo Pia was granted permission to photograph the shroud for the first time. Pia's photographs revealed something extraordinary. The image on the shroud appeared as a negative. When Pia developed his photographic plates, the negative image reversed into a positive, showing the features of a bearded man with remarkable clarity and detail. This discovery stunned observers. Photography had only been invented 60 years earlier. Medieval forgers could not have understood the concept of negative images. They certainly could not have created one intentionally. The photographic revelation transformed the shroud from a religious curiosity into a scientific enigma. If medieval artists created this image, how did they produce a perfect photographic negative 5 centuries before photography existed? The question demanded investigation. Throughout the 20th century, the shroud underwent increasingly sophisticated examinations. In 1969 and 1973, researchers conducted detailed studies of the cloth's composition and condition. They confirmed the linen was consistent with first-century Middle Eastern manufacture. They identified pollen grains from plants found only in Palestine. They discovered the image contained no paint, dye, or pigment of any kind. The most controversial examination occurred in 1988. 3 independent laboratories performed radiocarbon dating on small samples cut from the shroud. All 3 labs produced similar results. The cloth material dated to between 1260 and 1390, supporting the medieval forgery theory. The scientific community largely accepted this conclusion as definitive proof the shroud was not 2,000 years old. However, the carbon dating results created new problems. Critics argued the samples had been contaminated by centuries of handling, smoke exposure, and bacterial growth. Others noted the samples came from a corner of the shroud that had been extensively handled and possibly repaired. Some scientists questioned whether the 1932 fire and subsequent water damage had introduced modern carbon into the fabric, skewing the results. Additional research revealed anomalies the carbon dating could not explain. The blood on the shroud tested positive for human hemoglobin. The bloodstains showed anatomically correct flow patterns consistent with crucifixion wounds. The image displayed 3-dimensional encoding properties impossible to create before computer technology existed. The weaving pattern matched first-century Jewish burial cloths, not medieval European textiles. These contradictions left the shroud in scientific limbo. The carbon dating suggested medieval origin. Every other characteristic pointed to ancient authenticity. Believers and skeptics both claimed vindication while ignoring evidence that contradicted their positions. The Vatican maintained its traditional silence, neither confirming nor denying the relic's authenticity. In 2024, something changed. The Vatican granted permission for ultraviolet spectroscopy analysis of a preserved fragment. The decision suggested that someone in the Vatican hierarchy believed new technology might finally resolve the ancient mystery. Or perhaps they knew what the UV light would reveal and wanted the truth documented under controlled conditions. What the scientists discovered under that ultraviolet light would prove more disturbing than anyone anticipated. When light reveals the impossible, the ultraviolet lamps in the Vatican laboratory operated at wavelengths between 200 and 400 nanometers. This range sits just beyond violet in the visible spectrum. Human eyes cannot perceive these wavelengths, but specialized cameras and sensors can capture what UV light reveals. When organic materials absorb ultraviolet radiation, they often fluoresce, emitting visible light in response. Different substances produce different fluorescence patterns. This property makes UV light invaluable for detecting forgeries in artwork and documents. Dr. Marchetti expected the shroud fragment to fluoresce like any ancient textile. Centuries-old linen typically shows yellowish fluorescence under UV light. Medieval pigments produce characteristic colors depending on their mineral composition. Iron oxide glows orange. Carbon-based inks appear dark purple. Lead white emits bright blue. If the image had been painted or drawn, the UV analysis would identify the materials used. The first scan at 250 nanometers produced unexpected results. The linen fabric itself fluoresced as predicted, showing the pale yellow glow typical of aged organic fibers. but the image areas behaved differently. Instead of fluorescing, they absorbed the UV light. The facial features visible under normal illumination became darker and more defined under ultraviolet exposure. This absorption pattern was backward. It contradicted how painted or stained images should respond to UV radiation. Professor Hoffman adjusted the wavelength to 300 nanometers and ran a second scan. The absorption effect intensified. The image showed even greater contrast against the fluorescing background linen. Computer analysis measured the optical density across the fragment. The darkest areas of the image absorbed 92% of incoming UV light. Natural aging of linen does not produce this level of absorption. Neither do medieval painting techniques. At 365 nanometers, a standard wavelength for forensic examination, additional details emerged. The computer screen displayed the fragment in false color, with different absorption rates shown as different hues. The image contained gradations of intensity that created depth perception. Areas representing the cheekbone absorbed more UV light than areas representing the eye socket. This variation encoded three-dimensional topographical information into what appeared to be a flat image. Father Brennan requested the team examine the boundary between image and non-image areas at maximum magnification. The transition was abrupt. Individual linen fibers either showed the discoloration or did not. There was no gradual fade, no evidence of applied substance spreading from fiber to fiber. The affected fibers showed color change only on their surface, penetrating less than 0.2 microns deep. This measurement was crucial. Medieval and Renaissance artists worked with materials that penetrated fabric completely. Even modern painting techniques affect fabric at depths measured in millimeters, not fractions of microns. The spectroscopy analysis identified the chemical composition of the discoloration. The image consisted of oxidized and dehydrated cellulose, the primary component of linen fibers. Something had chemically altered the molecular structure of the outermost surface of specific fibers. The alteration appeared uniform across all affected areas. No pigments were present. No dyes had been applied. No binding agents held the image together. The discoloration was the result of a chemical change to the linen itself. Dr. Marchetti compared the UV absorption data to a database of known artistic techniques spanning 3,000 years of human history. No matches were found. She expanded the search to include natural processes that might discolor fabric. Mold growth, bacterial decomposition, exposure to specific chemicals, heat damage. None produced the superficial, uniform, three-dimensionally encoded pattern visible on the shroud fragment. Professor Hoffman proposed testing one final hypothesis. He recalibrated the UV system to pulse at high intensity for precisely measured intervals. The goal was to determine if the image might be a scorch mark created by brief exposure to intense energy. Controlled scorching of linen samples produced similar superficial discoloration, but the scorched samples lacked the three-dimensional encoding. They showed directionality based on heat source position. The shroud image showed neither characteristic. By early afternoon, the scientific team had eliminated every conventional explanation. The image was not painted, printed, scorched, or stained through any known method. Whatever created it operated through a mechanism that remained unidentified, and the blood evidence waiting to be analyzed would make the mystery even deeper. The blood that refuses to age. The shroud fragment contained three distinct areas of discoloration that appeared darker and more rust-colored than the yellowish facial image. Previous visual examination had identified these marks as probable blood residue. The UV spectroscopy analysis would determine their composition and age. What the tests revealed contradicted both medieval origin theories and modern contamination explanations. Blood contains iron in its hemoglobin molecules. When exposed to ultraviolet light, hemoglobin produces a distinctive fluorescent signature in the orange-red spectrum. Dr. Marchetti directed the UV scanner across the first blood mark, a small stain near the cheekbone area. The fluorescence pattern confirmed the presence of hemoglobin. This was human blood. But the spectral analysis showed something unusual. The blood contained elevated levels of bilirubin, a a yellow pigment produced when the body experiences extreme trauma or stress. Medieval artists attempting to create fake bloodstains would have used animal blood or iron oxide mixed with binding agents. Neither substance would contain bilirubin at the levels detected on the shroud fragment. The presence of this compound suggested the blood came from someone who experienced extraordinary physical trauma before death. Professor Hoffman conducted additional chemical analysis using non-destructive spectroscopy methods. The blood showed signs of clotting consistent with wounds made before death, not after. Living tissue responds to injury differently than dead tissue. When a person sustains wounds while alive, the blood clots in specific patterns as the body attempts to stop bleeding. Wounds inflicted after death produce different flow characteristics. The blood on the shroud fragment displayed ante-mortem clotting patterns. The person who left this blood was alive when wounded. The blood also contained serum albumin, a protein that separates from red blood cells when blood clots and sits undisturbed. This separation creates a clear, yellowish ring around dried bloodstains, a detail visible under UV light. Medieval forgers would not have known about serum separation. The phenomenon was not documented until the 18th century, yet the shroud fragment showed these characteristic serum rings surrounding each blood mark. Father Brennan requested DNA analysis of the blood residue. The request created immediate complications. Extracting DNA would require removing microscopic samples from the fragment, a destructive process the Vatican had not authorized. The examination protocol permitted only non-invasive testing. However, previous studies of other shroud samples had attempted DNA extraction with limited success. The results had been inconclusive, showing genetic material too degraded and contaminated to produce reliable sequencing. The UV analysis could determine blood age through a different method. Hemoglobin degrades over time through a process called hemolysis. The rate of degradation depends on environmental conditions, but follows predictable patterns. Blood from the medieval period shows specific degradation markers. Blood from the 1st century shows different characteristics. The shroud blood displayed degradation patterns inconsistent with 700-year-old material. The hemoglobin structure suggested much greater age. This finding directly contradicted the 1988 carbon dating results. If the cloth originated between 1260 and 1390, the blood should show corresponding age markers. Instead, the blood chemistry indicated it was significantly older than the dated cloth. Two possibilities existed. Either the carbon dating was flawed, or blood from an ancient source had been applied to a medieval cloth. The second scenario seemed implausible. How would medieval forgers obtain and preserve 2,000-year-old human blood? The blood distribution across the fragment revealed another significant detail. The stains followed anatomically correct flow patterns for gravity-affected bleeding from facial wounds. Blood from the hairline area flowed downward in rivulets consistent with a vertical body position. Blood near the cheekbone showed smearing patterns matching contact with fabric, while the wounds were still wet. These flow characteristics were precisely accurate for crucifixion positioning. A person hanging vertically would bleed in exactly these patterns. Medieval artists rarely achieved such anatomical precision. The study of blood flow dynamics did not exist as a scientific discipline until the 17th century, yet someone or something had created bloodstain patterns on this cloth that matched modern forensic understanding of trauma bleeding. The blood evidence should have provided clarity. Instead, it deepened the chronological paradox surrounding the shroud's origin, and the scientists still had no explanation for how the image itself was created. Theories that shatter under scrutiny. The scientific community has proposed multiple explanations for the Shroud of Turin over the past century. Each theory attempts to account for the image characteristics without invoking supernatural causes. The UV spectroscopy findings from the Vatican laboratory forced researchers to re-examine these conventional explanations. None survived scrutiny when confronted with the new evidence. The medieval forgery theory has dominated skeptical analysis since the 1988 carbon dating results. According to this explanation, a skilled 14th century artist created the shroud using painting techniques unknown to modern researchers. The theory suggests medieval craftsmen possessed secret methods for applying pigments so thinly that modern analysis cannot detect them. However, The UV examination eliminated this possibility. The spectroscopy scans identified no pigments, dyes, or binding agents whatsoever. The image consists solely of chemically altered linen fibers. Medieval painters could not change cellulose molecular structure without leaving traces of the chemical agents required for such alteration. The contact theory proposes that the image formed through direct contact between body and cloth. Substances on the skin, perhaps burial spices or body oils mixed with blood, transferred to the fabric and oxidized over time. This explanation accounts for the superficial nature of the discoloration, but it fails to explain the three-dimensional encoding revealed by UV analysis. Contact printing produces distorted images when cloth wraps around three-dimensional surfaces. A face pressed against fabric creates wider, flattened features. The shroud image shows correct facial proportions with accurate depth information, impossible through direct contact alone. The vapor diffusion theory suggests that chemical vapors from decomposing body tissue reacted with the linen to create the image. Ammonia, released during decay, could theoretically oxidize cellulose fibers. This process might explain the superficial discoloration depth. However, vapor diffusion produces blurred boundaries and uneven intensity. Gases do not travel in straight lines. They spread and disperse according to air currents and concentration gradients. The shroud image shows sharp transitions between image and non-image areas with no diffusion effects. The chemical uniformity across the entire image contradicts vapor formation mechanisms. In 1989, scientists proposed the radiation theory. According to this hypothesis, a burst of electromagnetic radiation from the body created the image through a scorching effect, similar to the shadows left on structures near Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the atomic explosions. Intense radiation can discolor organic material superficially without penetrating deeply. The theory gained attention because it potentially explained both the image formation and the three-dimensional encoding. However, controlled experiments with radiation exposure on linen produced images lacking the precise characteristics of the shroud. Radiation scorching shows directionality based on source position. It creates darker burns near the radiation origin and lighter marks at greater distances. The shroud image intensity correlates with cloth-to-body distance, but shows no radiation source directionality. More recent proposals invoke quantum mechanical processes. Some physicists suggest that unknown quantum effects during the moment of death might release energy in patterns we cannot yet reproduce or understand. This theory essentially admits the mechanism remains unexplained while proposing that future physics discoveries might provide answers. The quantum hypothesis cannot be tested or falsified with current technology. It represents speculation rather than explanation. The scientific divide over the shroud breaks along unexpected lines. Religious belief does not reliably predict researcher positions. Some Christian scientists argue forcefully for medieval forgery. Some atheist researchers acknowledge the image formation mechanism remains genuinely mysterious. The evidence does not align neatly with either faith-based or skeptical worldviews. The UV spectroscopy data from 2024 added new constraints to any viable explanation. The mechanism must account for superficial cellulose oxidation affecting only 0.2 microns depth. It must explain three-dimensional encoding without contact distortion. It must produce chemically uniform discoloration across irregular fabric surfaces. It must create anatomically accurate blood flow patterns containing trauma markers. No known natural process or artistic technique satisfies all these requirements simultaneously. The shroud remains unexplained, not because scientists refuse to investigate, but because the physical evidence contradicts every conventional mechanism proposed to account for it. Something created this image. Science simply cannot determine what that something was, what the Vatican refuses to confirm. The UV spectroscopy examination concluded at 4:30 in the afternoon on October 14, 2024. Dr. Marchetti, Professor Hoffman, and Father Brennan compiled their data into a preliminary report. The document contained spectral analysis graphs, chemical composition breakdowns, and high-resolution UV imagery. It totaled 83 pages. The Vatican required all three scientists to sign additional confidentiality agreements before leaving the laboratory. The report was classified under protocols typically reserved for diplomatic communications. 6 weeks later, portions of the preliminary findings appeared on academic message boards and research forums. The leaked information lacked the detailed technical data but described the key discoveries: human blood with trauma markers, three-dimensional image encoding, superficial cellulose oxidation with no pigments detected. The leaks generated immediate controversy within the scientific community. Researchers demanded access to the full data. The Vatican issued no response. In December 2024, Father Brennan gave a presentation at a molecular biology conference in Munich. He spoke about advances in non-destructive analysis of ancient organic materials. During the question period, an audience member asked directly about the Shroud examination. Father Brennan stated that he could neither confirm nor deny participation in any Vatican research projects. His refusal to answer was itself revealing. Scientists who conduct unremarkable research have no reason to hide their work. The Vatican's silence follows historical precedent. When previous Shroud examinations produced controversial results, the Church typically waited years before releasing official statements. After the 1973 conservation studies, 5 years passed before the Vatican permitted publication of findings. Following the 1988 carbon dating, 3 years elapsed before official commentary. The pattern suggests the institution carefully considers theological and political implications before acknowledging scientific data. The theological stakes are substantial. If the Vatican authenticates the Shroud as genuinely 2,000 years old and associated with crucifixion, it implies official confirmation of Christ's physical resurrection. The Catholic Church teaches resurrection as doctrine, but doctrine based on faith differs from doctrine supported by physical evidence. Authentication would fundamentally alter the relationship between religious belief and empirical proof. It would challenge the entire concept of faith as trust in the unseen. Alternatively, if the Vatican declares the Shroud a medieval forgery, it undermines centuries of veneration and pilgrim devotion. Millions of believers have prayed before this cloth. The Church has displayed it in official ceremonies. Declaring it fraudulent would embarrass the institution and potentially weaken credibility on other religious matters. The safest position remains the current ambiguity. Neither confirming nor denying allows believers to believe and skeptics to doubt without forcing the Vatican to take sides. The UV spectroscopy findings create particular difficulties for this ambiguous stance. The evidence does not suggest the Shroud is probably authentic or possibly genuine. The data indicates something scientifically inexplicable occurred. The Church must either acknowledge this mystery or suppress information that could reshape religious and scientific understanding. Suppression becomes increasingly difficult in an era of digital communication and leaked documents. Some Vatican observers suggest the institution has already made its decision. The 8-year delay in approving the UV examination, the classification of results, the confidentiality requirements imposed on researchers all point toward permanent silence. The Church may have concluded that some questions serve faith better when left unanswered. Mystery preserves belief in ways that confirmation or denial cannot. Other analysts propose a different interpretation. The Vatican commissioned this examination using cutting-edge technology. That decision implies interest in truth rather than comfortable ambiguity. Perhaps the institution is preparing for eventual disclosure once theological and political frameworks are established to manage the implications. As of December 2024, the full UV spectroscopy report remains classified. The Shroud fragment has been returned to its climate-controlled vault. Dr. Marchetti, Professor Hoffman, and Father Brennan continue their research in their respective fields. They have published nothing about their October work in the Vatican laboratory. The scientific community waits, the faithful pray, and the ancient linen cloth keeps its secrets, illuminated but unexplained, examined but not understood, studied but never fully revealed. The ultraviolet light showed what human eyes could not see. Whether anyone will be allowed to see what the light revealed remains the final unanswered question. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.